The 10th month of the year. November means 9th and December means 10th. Every single one of these names is wrong. You learnt these words.
Okay, right now, this is the type of stuff I'm interested in watching right now. So, hope you enjoy the information, the wisdom, the knowledge, and the truth which is being going on all the time. And that's what I've been talking about from then. Erase century. We didn't know that they been lying about time and all that, but it's just as proof to show what's going on. Nature don't lie, God don't lie. So enjoy the show. Remember to like and subscribe.
Before you could read, you have used them every day of your life. They are not slightly off, not debatable, not open to interpretation. September is the 9th month, but its Latin root means 7. October is the 10th month, but octo means 8. Septem, octo, novum, decem are the Latin words for 7, 8, 9, 10. Those names belong to a calendar that no longer exists. Someone added months to the beginning of the year and pushed everything forward. That edit happened roughly 2,700 years ago, and we are still living inside it. That is not even the strange part of this story. The strange part is what was there before the edit, what was removed, and who benefits from you never asking about it. There are 13 full moons in a solar year, not 12, 13. The lunar cycle, new moon to new moon, takes approximately 29 and a half days. Multiply that by 12, and you get 354 days. You are 11 days short of a year. But multiply 28 by 13, and you get 364. 1 day short, one single day that ancient cultures handled with a festival, a day outside of time, a reset before the new year began. The math is cleaner with 13. It has always been cleaner with 13. And humanity knew this for thousands of years before anyone intervened. In 1960, a Belgian archaeologist named Jean de Heinzelin made a discovery on the shores of Lake Edward. The site sits on the border between Uganda and the Democratic Republic of Congo. The object was small, the Ishango bone, a baboon fibula, roughly the size of a pencil, with a sharp piece of quartz fixed to one end. Carved into its surface are 3 rows of grouped notches. It has been dated to approximately 20,000 years ago. That makes it one of the oldest mathematical artifacts ever found. Harvard archaeologist Alexander Marshak put the bone under a microscope and concluded the notches correspond to lunar cycles. 6 months of them. Ethno-mathematician Claudia Zaslavsky went further. She proposed the bone's creator was likely a woman tracking her menstrual cycle against the phases of the moon. The average menstrual cycle is 29.3 days. The lunar cycle is 29.5. In dozens of languages, the words for month and moon share the same root. The Gaelic words for menstruation and calculation are identical, miosak and miosakan. The Romans literally called the measurement of time menstruation. This was not a metaphor, it was a description. Humanity's first act of counting may have been a woman watching the moon and marking the days between bleedings, 13 times a year. For 20,000 years or more, that was how humans understood time, not because someone told them to, because the sky told them to. Then Rome happened. The earliest Roman calendar, attributed to Romulus around 738 BCE, had only 10 months, 304 days. The year started in March and ended in December, when nothing officially happened. Around 713 BCE, Rome's second king, Numa Pompilius, decided to fill that gap. He added 2 new months, January and February, to the calendar. To get enough days, he shortened the existing 30-day months to 29. February was left with 28 because it was the month given over to the infernal gods. Even the Romans considered it cursed. But here is what matters about Numa's reform. He did not just add months. He created a system where the timing of additional months, called intercalations, was controlled exclusively by a board. Their decisions about when to add time were kept secret. If you control the calendar, you control power. A consul could extend his own term by persuading the pontifices to add an intercalary month, or shorten a rival's term by having them skip one. Calendar manipulation became so corrupt that by the 1st century BCE, the Roman calendar was 3 full months out of alignment with the seasons. Harvest festivals happened before crops were taken in. Julius Caesar had to add 90 extra days to a single year, 46 BCE, just to reset the system. He He called it the last year of confusion. But the confusion was not an accident. It was the residue of centuries of institutional calendar control. And the 12-month structure that emerged from Caesar's reform became the foundation we still use today. Nobody voted on it. Nobody studied alternatives. A dictator imposed it, and the world inherited it. Now, the fair counter-argument. The Gregorian was more accurate for tracking the solar year than anything that came before it. The Julian calendar drifted about one day every 128 years. The Gregorian system, introduced by Pope Gregory XIII in 1502, corrected that drift by adjusting the leap year rules. It works. Astronomically, it is elegant. I'm not arguing it fails at what it does. I'm asking a different question. Who decided that solar accuracy should override lunar alignment? Who decided that the relationship between humans and the moon, the oldest timekeeping relationship in human history, should be sacrificed for a system that serves institutions rather than biology? Because the Gregorian reform was not neutral. It was a deletion. On October 4, 1582, people in Catholic Europe went to bed on a Thursday. They woke up on Friday, October 15, 10 days erased, not gradually phased out, not adjusted over years, removed overnight by papal decree. Pope Gregory chose October specifically because it contained the fewest major Christian holidays. Workers did not know if they would be paid for the missing days. Contracts scheduled between October 5 and October 14 suddenly referenced dates that had never existed, and the Vatican's response was simple. Those days were never real. Protestant countries refused to comply. England held out until 1752, 170 years later, when Parliament finally adopted the Gregorian calendar. September 2nd was followed by September 14. The change affected wages, rents, military discharges, and prison sentences. Accounts from the period describe public outrage. The famous cry, "Give us back our 11 days," may be partly mythologized, but the sentiment was real. People understood instinctively that when someone edits your calendar, they are editing something more fundamental than dates. They are editing your experience of reality itself. If time can be rewritten by decree, what else can be? And yet, what happened next is the part almost nobody talks about. In 1902, a British railway accountant named Moses Cotsworth proposed something radical, a calendar with 13 months, each month exactly 28 days. Every date falling on the same weekday every year. The first of every month, always a Sunday. The extra month, placed between June and July, would be called Sol. One additional day at year's end, called the Year Day, would sit outside any month or week. A global holiday belonging to no one. Cotsworth was not a mystic. He was an accountant driven mad by a specific problem. Monthly financial reports at his railroad company were meaningless because months had different numbers of days and different distributions of weekdays. A hotel doing $10,000 per week in room sales would show lower revenue in May than April. Not because business declined, because May had fewer weekends that year. Think about what that means for every salaried worker alive today. You earn the same monthly paycheck, whether the month has 28 your daily rate of pay, and it always favors the employer. Your landlord charges identical rent for February and for March, despite March having 3 extra days. Quarterly financial comparisons are unreliable because quarters range from 90 to 92 days. The entire global economy runs on a unit of measurement, the month, that has no fixed size. We would never tolerate this in any other domain. Imagine a kilogram that weighed something different each time you placed it on a scale. That is what a month does to money. Cotsworth saw this clearly, and he wanted to fix it. His proposal gained powerful allies. George Eastman, founder of the Eastman Kodak Company, became obsessed with the idea. In 1928, Eastman adopted the 13-month calendar for Kodak's internal operations. Every financial period equal, every comparison clean, every payday predictable. Kodak employees carried pocket calendars with 13 months. Boardrooms displayed the fixed calendar on their walls. The system worked so well that Kodak used it for 61 years, until 1989, 57 years after Eastman's death. A Fortune 500 company ran on 13 months for more than half a century, and it worked better than 12. Eastman did not stop at Kodak. He and Cotsworth wrote to more than 1,000 businesses. They opened the International Fixed Calendar League, headquartered at Kodak's offices in Rochester, New York. Sir Sanford Fleming, the man who invented standard time zones, became its first president. The League of Nations reviewed 130 calendar proposals from around the world. They ranked Cotsworth's 13-month system as the best. It went to a vote, and religious leaders organized to destroy it. Rabbi Joseph Hertz argued that Year Day, which belonged to no week, would create an 8-day week once per year. This would disrupt the perpetual 7-day Sabbath cycle. The opposition was fierce, coordinated, and effective. The proposal failed. After Eastman died in 1932, the League of Nations continued discussing reform, but could not reach consensus. Then came Hitler. Then came World War II. The League dissolved. No international body has seriously considered calendar reform since. 13 months came within one vote of becoming the global standard. Then it was buried. Not by logic, not by evidence, by institutional resistance from organizations whose authority is structured around the calendar as it exists. I want to be honest about something. I sat with this research for a long time before writing. The reason is simple. The mainstream explanation for why we use 12 months is not stupid. Solar calendars are more practical for agriculture in many climates. The Gregorian system does not require constant adjustment the way lunar solar calendars do. If you need to know when to plant crops at a specific latitude, the sun matters more than the moon. I understand why solar calendars won. What I cannot explain is why 13 had to become feared in the process. The word triskaidekaphobia, fear of the number 13, was first documented in 1910. But scholars who have searched for ancient evidence of 13 being considered unlucky have found none. The association with the Last Supper, 13 people at the table, appears to be a medieval invention. The Norse myth about Loki as the 13th guest at a banquet does not appear in the original source texts the way it is commonly told. Buildings skip the 13th floor. Airlines skip row 13. Streets in London, including Fleet Street, Park Lane, and Oxford Street, have no number 13. In 1882, a Civil War veteran named William Fowler founded the 13 Club in New York City. 13 members met on the 13th of every month in room 13 of the Knickerbocker Cottage. They walked under ladders. They mocked the superstition. The inaugural dinner was at 8:13 p.m. on Friday, January 13, 1882. The cruel irony is that the club's publicity may have spread the very fear it tried to debunk. But where did the fear originate? One theory connects it directly to calendars. 12 is considered complete. 12 months, 12 hours, 12 zodiac signs, 12 apostles. 13 breaks the pattern. 13 suggests something was supposed to be there that someone removed. You do not fear a number without a reason. You fear it because somewhere, deep in cultural memory, 13 represented something that had to be suppressed. And here is what keeps pulling me back. Ethiopia still uses 13 months. Right now, today. 12 months of 30 days each, plus a 13th month called Pagume, 5 days long, 6 in a leap year. Their system derives from the ancient Coptic calendar, which traces to Egypt. Their tourism slogan is, and I'm not making this up, 13 months of sunshine. Over 120 million people live on a 13-month calendar. Their leap year system is simpler than ours. Their months are uniform. Their year starts in September, which, under their reckoning, actually makes sense. They never adopted the Gregorian system. They were never colonized into it. And their calendar works. It has worked for centuries. When travelers land in Addis Ababa, their phones adjust the date automatically. The shift is disorienting. You step off a plane, and you are suddenly 7 or 8 years younger. Not because Ethiopia miscounted, because they started from a different calculation of the same event and never let anyone overwrite their math. Ethiopia. Think about what you were taught. 30 days has September, April, June, and November. All the rest have 31. Except February. You needed a nursery rhyme to remember your own calendar. That should tell you something. A system designed for human use would not require a poem to decode. No child struggles to understand 13 times 28. Any child can grasp that. But 30, 31, 28, sometimes 29? That requires memorization. It requires a rhyme. It requires faith in a structure that resists intuition. Kodak proved equal months' work. The League of Nations ranked them best. Ethiopia runs on them today. The Ashango bone suggests humans counted in 13s for 20,000 years before anyone intervened. Your body still counts in cycles of roughly 28 days. The moon still completes 13 cycles every year. The biology has not changed. The astronomy has not changed. Only the calendar changed. And every time someone tried to change it back, the proposal was killed. Not by science, not by popular demand, by institutions whose power depends on controlling how we measure time. I find myself thinking about the pontifices, Rome's calendar priests, keeping their intercalation decisions secret, using time itself as a lever of political control. That was 2,700 years ago. The mechanisms have changed. The principle has not. Whoever controls the calendar controls what feels normal. And once something feels normal, no one questions it. We cannot name our months correctly. We cannot remember how many days they contain. We carry a nursery rhyme in our heads because the system is too irrational to memorize on its own, and we never ask why. That 20,000-year-old bone sits in a museum in Brussels. Its notches still line up with the moon. The sky still counts to 13. The only question is why we stop. There is a light bulb in a fire station in Livermore, California. It has been burning continuously since the year 1901. That is 125 years and counting. No one can fully explain why it still works. But in 1924, a group of executives met in Geneva. They made certain no one would ever build another bulb like it. That light bulb is one of 10 stories I'm going to tell you today, and by the end, you will understand that they are all the same story. Today's video is a little different from what we usually do on this channel. Instead of one deep investigation, I am walking through 10 inventions that worked. 10 inventions that were verified, demonstrated, patented, or sold. And 10 inventions that were destroyed, classified, or erased. Not by accident, but by design. I have numbered them from 10 to 1. Number 10 is strange enough to stop you cold. Number 1 will change how you see everything you own. Number 10. In 1985, a fire broke out on a plane at Manchester Airport. 55 people died in 40 seconds. Not from the flames, from the toxic smoke. A hairdresser in Hartlepool, England, named Maurice Ward, watched the news and decided to do something about it. He had no formal training in chemistry. He made his own hair dyes and shampoos. But over months of mixing compounds in his kitchen, sometimes 20 formulations in a single day, he created something impossible. He called it Starlight. In March 1990, the BBC programme Tomorrow's World coated a raw egg in Starlight and held a blowtorch to it for several minutes.
This torch here is producing a temperature of 1200 degrees Celsius. Now try cooking an ordinary egg like that, and in a very few seconds, the results would be quite an explosion. But I'm going to leave this torch here, blowing on this egg for a couple of minutes before we crack it open. And it ought to survive the inferno because it's coated with a remarkable new plastic.
When they cracked the egg open, it was still raw and cold inside. The material had blocked thousands of degrees of direct heat. Senior British defence officials, including the chief scientific advisor to the Ministry of Defence, publicly confirmed the material's extraordinary thermal properties. Ward claimed it could withstand temperatures up to 10,000 degrees Celsius. NASA was interested. Boeing was interested. ICI, the British Ministry of Defence, multiple defence contractors, all of them came knocking. Ward refused every deal. He demanded 51% ownership. He never filed a patent because he feared reverse engineering. He died in 2011 at the age of 78. The formula, as far as the public knows, died with him. A material that could have protected aircraft, buildings, and spacecraft from fire and nuclear heat. Gone. Not because it failed, because one man would not let go of it, and no institution was willing to meet his terms. Number 9. In 1996, General Motors built the EV1. It was the first modern mass-produced electric car from a major automaker. It had regenerative braking, a sleek aerodynamic frame, and customers who described it as the best car they had ever driven. GM built 1,117 of them, but here is what made the EV1 different from every other car GM ever produced. You could not buy one. The contract explicitly prohibited purchase, lease only. When GM decided to end the program in 1999, they did not sell the remaining cars. They did not donate them. They did not store them. They repossessed every single one, loaded them onto trucks, drove them to Mesa, Arizona, and crushed them. Customers protested. Some chained themselves to the cars. Others sent checks to GM begging to buy them outright. GM returned the checks and sent the cars to the crusher. About 40 survived, donated to museums and universities. Every one of them had its drivetrain permanently disabled. You could look at it, you could never drive it again. GM spent over $1 billion developing electric vehicle technology, then chose to physically destroy the result. In 2026, GM is now helping restore the only privately owned EV1 in existence. The same company that crushed them is rebuilding one for its 30th anniversary. Number 8. In February 1938, Popular Mechanics ran a cover story calling hemp the new billion-dollar crop. A single plant that could produce paper, textiles, rope, biofuel, and over 25,000 commercial products. That same year, the Marijuana Tax Act effectively criminalized all hemp cultivation in the United States. The timing was not coincidental. Historians have identified several powerful figures who stood to benefit enormously from hemp's elimination. William Randolph Hearst owned vast timber and paper interests. DuPont had just patented nylon and other synthetic fibers. Andrew Mellon, the Secretary of the Treasury and DuPont's primary banker, appointed his own nephew-in-law, Harry Anslinger, to run the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, a billion-dollar crop destroyed in months. Not because the plant was dangerous, because a machine called the hemp decorticator had just made it cheap enough to threaten 3 of the most powerful industries in America. And during World War II, when the government suddenly needed hemp again, the USDA produced a propaganda film called Hemp for Victory. It urged farmers to grow the very plant they had just criminalized. Number 7. Nikola Tesla designed a tower on Long Island to transmit electrical energy wirelessly across the globe. No wires, no meters, no bills. JP Morgan funded the project with approximately $150,000, believing it was for wireless communication to compete with Marconi. When Morgan understood Tesla's actual goal was free wireless power, the funding vanished. Morgan could not see how to monetize electricity if anyone could draw it from the air. The tower was never completed. It was demolished in 1917 to pay Tesla's debts. Tesla died on January 7, 1943, in room 3327 of the New Yorker Hotel. He was 86 years old. He died alone. Within hours, the Office of Alien Property Custodian seized his papers and personal belongings. Tesla was a naturalized United States citizen. Some of those materials remain classified. The man who gave the world alternating current, the foundations of radio and remote control technology, died with almost nothing. He died because he tried to give electricity away for free. I spent 3 days sitting with this section before I could write it, not because the facts are unclear, because every way I tried to frame it sounded like I was exaggerating. I was not. That is what happened. Number 6. Everything I've told you so far involves inventions that reached the public before they were killed. Starlight was demonstrated on television. The EV1 was driven on public roads. The inventions that never made it that far. The Invention Secrecy Act of 1951 is an active federal law. It is codified at Title 35 of the United States Code, sections 181 through 188. Under this law, every patent application filed in the United States can be reviewed by defense agencies. If any agency determines that publication of the invention would be detrimental to the national security, a secrecy order is imposed. The inventor cannot talk about it, develop it, sell it, or acknowledge it exists. Violation carries up to 2 years in federal prison. As of fiscal year 2025, there are 6,543 patents under active secrecy orders. That number comes directly from the United States Patent and Trademark Office via a Freedom of Information Act response. Between 2013 and 2017, an average of 117 new inventions were classified per year. Only 25 were declassified. The backlog grows every year. A leaked 1971 category list revealed that solar photovoltaic generators were classified as a restricted technology. Solar panels, suppressed for national security over 50 years ago. One patent filed in 1936 was not declassified until 2000. 64 years. It was a manual code machine, completely obsolete by the time they released it. This is not speculation. The law is public. The statistics are public. The FOIA letters are public. Every invention I have discussed before this one got far enough for you to hear about it. 6,543 others did not. Number 5. December 23, 1924, 2 days before Christmas, Geneva, Switzerland. Executives from Osram, Philips, Compagnie de Lampes, and General Electric gathered in a hotel room. They called themselves the Phoebus Cartel, named after the Greek god of light. By 1924, light bulbs lasted between 1,500 and 2,500 hours. The cartel agreed to reduce that to exactly 1,000 hours. They did not simply make worse bulbs. They spent years engineering a bulb that reliably failed at 1,000 hours. That is harder than building a better one. Manufacturers were fined if their bulbs lasted too long. Samples were shipped to a central testing laboratory in Switzerland for verification. A graph from the Berlin Municipal Archive shows the results. Average bulb lifespan dropped from 1,800 hours in 1926 to 1,205 hours by 1934. In 1949, a United States District Court found General Electric had violated the Sherman Antitrust Act through its role in the cartel. And that light bulb in Livermore, California, the one I mentioned at the start, it was installed in 1901, before the cartel existed. It is still burning. They did not just shorten a product's life, they invented a philosophy, make it worse on purpose, sell more. Every industry that followed learned the lesson. Number 4. Royal Raymond Rife was an American inventor who built instruments he claimed could observe and target microorganisms at magnifications beyond conventional optical limits. In 1934, he claimed to have treated 14 terminal cancer patients using specific electromagnetic frequencies. Morris Fishbein, head of the American Medical Association, reportedly tried to acquire a share of the technology. Rife refused. What followed was systematic. His laboratory was vandalized. His key research partner, Dr. Milbank Johnson, died under unclear circumstances. A 1953 report to the United States Senate Interstate Commerce Committee, known as the Fitzgerald Report, investigated the suppression of alternative cancer treatments. It found documented evidence that the AMA had obstructed competing therapies. I want to be honest about something. I cannot tell you Rife's device worked as he claimed. No independent replication has confirmed it. The scientific establishment's skepticism may be justified, but the Senate did not investigate whether Rife was right. They investigated whether the system gave him a fair chance to prove it, and the answer, according to their own report, was no. Number 3. Stanley Allen Meyer built a dune buggy in Columbus, Ohio, that he said ran on water. He called his device a water fuel cell. He held multiple United States patents, including patent number 4936961. He demonstrated the car on local television. In 1996, 2 investors sued him. The court and ordered Meyer to refund $25,000. I'm not going to tell you the water car worked. The court said it did not. But on March 20, 1998, Meyer sat down at a Cracker Barrel restaurant in Grove City, Ohio, with his brother Stephen and 2 Belgian investors. He took a sip of cranberry juice. Then he grabbed his neck, ran outside, fell to his knees in the parking lot, and vomited violently. His brother ran to him. Meyer looked up and said, "They poisoned me." He was 57 years old. The Franklin County coroner ruled his death a cerebral aneurysm. No poison was found. Meyer had high blood pressure. That is the official record. Whether you believe it or not, a man who challenged the energy industry died in a parking lot at 57, and his last words accused someone of killing him. That sentence sits in the air whether the car worked or not. Number 2. At one time, approximately 17,000 named apple varieties existed in the United States. Today, only about 4,500 are known to survive. Just 15 varieties account for 90% of what you see in grocery stores. Across all vegetable crops, the USDA catalogues 7,262 varieties in 1903. By 1983, 94% of those specific varieties had disappeared from commercial catalogues. They were not lost to drought or disease, they were replaced by patented hybrid seeds engineered so that harvested seeds do not produce viable new plants. If you are a farmer, you must buy new seed every year. The Plant Patent Act of 1930 made it legal to own a living organism. For 10,000 years, farmers saved seed and shared freely. That cycle broke in a single century. 3 corporations now control over half the world's commercial seed supply. The Svalbard Global Seed Vault in Norway, a bunker carved into an Arctic mountain, stores backup seeds from around the world. Its existence is an admission. What remains is fragile enough to need a doomsday backup. Former FBI agent David Benscoter now searches abandoned orchards in the Pacific Northwest looking for apple varieties thought to be extinct. Since 2014, his Lost Apple project has rediscovered over 29 varieties. He is not solving a crime. He is undoing an erasure that most people do not even know happened. Number 1. In 1932, a New York real estate broker named Bernard London published a 20-page pamphlet. It was called Ending the Depression Through Planned Obsolescence. His proposal was simple. The government would assign an official expiration date to every manufactured product: shoes, cars, buildings, furniture, clothing, machinery. After the expiration date, the product would be declared legally dead. The owner would be required by law to surrender it for government-supervised destruction. Then purchase a replacement. Force consumption to restart the economy. The pamphlet is real. It is 20 pages. It is publicly available. But look around your house. Your phone slows down after 2 years. Your appliances fail just past the warranty. Your printer stops working when a chip says the ink is empty, even when it is not. In 2020, Apple paid $113 million to settle claims that they deliberately slowed older iPhones. The Thieves' cartel made light bulbs die at 1,000 hours. GM crushed cars that worked. Seeds were engineered so you cannot replant them. Bernard London did not change anything. He just wrote down what was already happening. And what has not stopped since. Every story in this video follows the same pattern. Something worked. Someone profited from its failure. And a system ensured that failure was the only outcome. The law exists. The statistics exist. The documents exist. The pamphlet exists. You can read it tonight. The question is not whether this happened. The question is what else is sitting in those 6,543 classified files that you are not allowed to see, and whether the next invention that could change your life is already locked inside one of them. In 1838, a group of Boston merchants solved an expensive problem. They'd been paying for private guards to watch their ships. They paid more guards to protect cargo moving between the port and warehouses. The cost was cutting into their profits every single year. So they proposed something that would change American history forever. What if the public paid for their security instead? What if they called the whole arrangement a police department? That is not a theory, but documented. Thing you think you know about American policing, because for the first 200 years of this country, there were none. No departments, no precincts, no badges, no uniforms, no one to call. The story of how that changed is not the story you were taught. Before 1838, American cities relied on a system inherited from medieval England called the Night Watch. Boston started one in 1636, New York followed in 1658, Philadelphia in 1700. The concept was simple. Volunteers would walk the streets from sunset to sunrise, carrying a rattle and a 6-foot pole painted blue and white. They watched for fires, listened for disturbances, and were supposed to confront criminals. If they spotted trouble, they raised what was called a hue and cry, shaking the rattle and shouting until nearby citizens came running to help. The watchman himself was not expected to handle the problem alone. He was an alarm system with legs. In practice, the entire operation was a disaster. Watchmen routinely drank on duty. They slept through their shifts. Some communities required watchmen to call out the hour aloud, not to inform the public, but to prove the watchman was still awake. And here is the detail that reframes the entire system. In many colonies, night watch duty was assigned as punishment. If you committed a petty crime, your sentence might be walking the streets at night pretending to keep other people safe. The person protecting your neighborhood might be doing it because he got caught stealing from someone else's. It gets worse. Every able-bodied man could be called to serve on the watch. But if you were wealthy enough, you could pay a substitute. And who did the wealthy hire? According to crime historian Gary Potter, the substitutes were often criminals and community thugs. So the choice was this. Your street was either patrolled by a convicted criminal serving a sentence or a hired criminal paid by someone rich enough to avoid the duty himself. That was the system. For 200 years. The constables who supervised the night watch were barely better. They worked on a fee basis, paid per warrant served. Their income depended not on preventing crime, but on processing it. The more warrants they served, the more they earned. The more arrests they made, the better their year. Nobody measured whether the neighborhood was safe. Nobody counted crimes prevented. The only metric was crimes processed for payment. This was not public safety. This was a business model. And nobody rich enough to matter was complaining because they had private security. While the North ran this broken volunteer operation, the South built something entirely different. In 1704, the Carolina colonies established the first formal slave patrols, groups of armed white men on horseback authorized to stop, search, and brutalize enslaved people found without written permission from their enslaver. Virginia followed in 1727, North Carolina in 17. Slaveholding state had them. The patrol oath required men to swear they would search for guns, swords, and other weapons among the enslaved. That oath is the earliest known sworn statement of American law enforcement, not a promise to protect citizens, a promise to search for weapons among people being held against their will. These were not informal posses. These were organized, government-sanctioned forces with specific jurisdictions and regular schedules. By 1837, Charleston's Slave Patrol had over 100 officers. That made it the largest organized policing force in America. Larger than any city's night watch, larger than any constable system in the North. The first professional law enforcement apparatus in this country was not designed to stop crime. It was designed to stop freedom. Now, here is where the standard explanation comes in, and it deserves a fair hearing. Cities were growing explosively in the early 1800s. New York's population hit 400,000. The night watch of 80 men was laughably inadequate for a city that size. Crime was rising, riots were frequent, immigration was accelerating, and with it, social friction. Something had to change, and the British model of professional policing, created by Robert Peel in London in 1829, offered a template. All of that is true. I am not disputing that cities needed better systems. The night watch was genuinely failing. What I am questioning is who the new system was designed for, because the evidence points somewhere very specific, and it is not toward the general public. Boston in 1838 was one of the largest shipping centers in America. Merchants had been spending their own money on private guards to protect property at the port and along trade routes. Then someone realized the math could work differently. If protecting commercial goods could be reframed as a matter of collective public safety, the cost would shift from merchants to taxpayers. The city created the day police. 6 officers working under the city marshal. The first publicly funded police force in American history. Not created by a vote of citizens demanding protection. Created by commercial interests who found a way to make everyone else pay their security bills. The full Boston Police Department followed in 1854 with 250 officers. Each one paid $2 per shift. Their primary task was maintaining order, which in practice meant protecting property and controlling the populations that threatened commercial activity. New York followed in 1845. The state legislature authorized up to 800 officers. And what happened next should concern anyone who believes the system was designed to function. The officers refused to wear uniforms, not quietly. They organized a public rally that drew 1,500 people. Officers stood before the crowd and called They were no serfs. They said that being forced to identify themselves as police would bury popular freedom. Some were dismissed for refusing to comply. They appealed to the courts. It took 8 years of bitter public debate before New York finally adopted uniforms in 1853. The first outfit was a leather helmet, a blue frock coat buttoned to the neck, and grey trousers with a black stripe. 20 years later, in 1874, officers still reported that wearing the uniform drew insulting remarks from the public. These men, and they did not want anyone to know they were police. The public did not want to know either. Both sides distrusted the institution from its first day. There was no training. None. Officers were appointed for 1 or 2 year terms, nominated by the alderman of whatever political ward they lived in. If the ward leader liked you, you got a badge. If he did not, you were gone. By the 1870s, the Tammany Hall political machine controlled nearly every appointment in the New York department. Positions were bought and sold openly. The police did not serve the public. They served whoever had enough political power to put them on the street. I spent 3 weeks with this material before I could figure out how to present it. Not because the evidence is thin, the opposite. There is so much documented so plainly in sources that are not obscure or contested that the real difficulty is explaining why none of it is common knowledge. I kept circling back to one thing that genuinely troubled me. The Boston Police Department's own official website describes its history. It lists the dates, it names the night watch, it mentions the day police of 1838. All of this information is right there, publicly available on a government website. There is no cover-up. There is no conspiracy of silence. There is just a version of the story with the financial motivation edited out, told so flatly that nobody thinks to ask who benefited. You learn about the Boston Tea Party in school. You learn about the Constitutional Convention. You do not learn that the first police officers in American history were merchant-funded guards who refused to be identified and served at the pleasure of political bosses. That omission is not accidental, it is structural. The same way you do not learn that America had no birth certificates until the early 1900s, or that street addresses were invented for purposes that had nothing to do with mail delivery, and the structure broke down faster than anyone expected. 12 years after New York created its police force, the city had two of them. Mayor Fernando Wood controlled the municipal police, a force loyal to his democratic political machine. In 1857, the Republican state legislature created a new metropolitan police force to replace Wood's men. Wood refused to disband. On June 16, 1857, the two forces attacked each other on the steps of City Hall. Officers in blue fought officers in blue. Neither side knew which force had legal authority. One contemporary account described 5 Points criminals dancing in the streets while the two police forces brawled. Arrests made by one force were overturned by the other. Suspects were captured by municipal officers and immediately released by metropolitan officers. The entire concept of law and order collapsed into farce. The National Guard had to be called in. The State Court of Appeals eventually ruled the Metropolitan Police legitimate. 12 years. That is how long it took for American policing to descend into a physical war with itself. The institution was so thoroughly controlled by political interests that two rival power structures created two rival armies, and the citizens those armies were supposed to protect watched from the sidelines while their taxes funded both. Follow the money forward, and the pattern holds. By the 1880s, NYPD Superintendent Thomas Burns had accumulated personal wealth of $350,000. Adjusted for inflation, that is roughly $9.6 million today. Where did a police superintendent get that kind of money? From investments, made on his behalf by Cornelius Vanderbilt and Jay Gould. Two of the wealthiest men in America were personally enriching the head of the city's police force. In exchange, the NYPD provided what historians describe as the ruthless suppression of unions and political dissent. The city's bankers, stockbrokers, and real estate developers tolerated police corruption because the police kept their boots on the throat of organized labor. Taxpayers funded the force. The wealthy directed it. The superintendent pocketed the gratitude. That triangle is not an aberration. It is the blueprint. And it's scaled. By the 1880s, every major American city had a police department, all publicly funded, all modeled on the same basic structure, all answering not to voters but to political machines and commercial interests. The expansion was driven not by rising crime alone, but by the need to control labor. Waves of Irish, Italian, German, and Eastern European immigrants were arriving in cities. They were forming unions, they were organizing strikes, they were demanding better wages. And the people who profited from their labor needed a publicly funded mechanism to keep them working. That is not speculation. Crime historian Gary Potter documents that fears of labor, union organizers, and immigrant populations drove the expansion of police forces across every major city by the end of the century. If your family came through Ellis Island, if your great-grandparents worked the docks or the factories or the railroads, consider this. The police force in their city was not built to protect them. It was built to manage them. Think about what this means for you right now. The structure has not changed. The badges look different. The training exists now, in theory. But the financial architecture is identical. Total government spending on policing in the United States reached $237.7 billion in 2024, according to the Bureau of Economic Analysis. The NYPD's budget alone exceeds $5.4 billion annually. In most American cities, policing is the single largest line item in the general fund. 40 to 60% of everything the city spends. You fund this every year. A system that began because a group of shipping merchants in 1838 decided their private security costs should become your problem. I want to be careful here. The point is not that police serve no purpose or that public safety is unimportant. That is an easy dismissal that avoids the harder question. The question is whether an institution engineered from its first hour to serve commercial interests was ever structurally capable of serving the public. One that was controlled from its first decade by political machines, corrupted from its first generation by financial elites. The night watchmen were drunks and criminals. The slave patrols were state-sponsored terror. The first police departments were merchant-funded, politically operated patronage systems. Each phase was built on the foundation of the last, not reformed, absorbed, expanded, renamed. You walk past police stations every day. You see the cruisers parked on your block. You dial the number without thinking. It feels permanent, like something that has always been here. But it has not always been here. For most of American history, it was not here at all. And when it arrived not because citizens demanded protection. It arrived because someone with money realized they could make the public pay for what they used to pay for themselves. The receipts survive. The timeline is clean. The names are in the public record. The question nobody puts in the textbooks is the one that matters most. If the people who built this system did not build it for you, then who was it built for? And if it is still running on the same financial architecture 2 centuries later, is it possible the answer has not changed? $237 billion a year. Same architecture. Same question. The night watchman's rattles went silent a long time ago. The 6-foot poles were retired. The slave patrols lost their legal authority in 1865 and reorganized under different names. But the bills never stopped coming. They just got bigger. And the line between who pays and who benefits has never been fully redrawn. $237 billion. Every year, taken from the public to fund an institution that the public never designed, never requested, and was never given the chance to build from scratch. It was designed that way. In 1838, and nobody redesigned it since. The merchants are gone. The invoice remains. The last American who remembered the old world. What she told her family before dying in 1953, there's a filing cabinet in the Library of Congress that contains the voices of dead Americans, not recordings, transcriptions. Thousands of pages of handwritten and typed interviews conducted between 1936 and 1940 by government writers who were sent into homes across 24 states with a single instruction: get their stories before they're gone. The program was called the Federal Writers Project, a branch of Roosevelt's New Deal that employed out-of-work journalists, novelists, and researchers to document the lives of ordinary citizens. They collected 2,900 life histories. Then they filed them in the Library of Congress, where they sat mostly unread for nearly 40 years. I found them because I was looking for something else. I was tracing architectural records from the 1870s, trying to understand why so many American courthouses and government buildings from that era feature proportions that don't match the people who supposedly used them. The same question I keep running into. But the deeper I went into those archives, the more I realized the buildings weren't the real story. The people were. Because those 2,900 interviews captured something no textbook ever could. The first-hand memories of Americans who were alive before everything changed, and what they described doesn't match the history we've been taught. Let me explain what I mean by before everything changed. Consider the math. An American born in 1855 who lived to 85, not unusual, would have died in 1940. That means they were alive, speaking, remembering when those government writers knocked on their doors. They would have been children during the 1860s and 1870s. They would have witnessed the most dramatic transition in American history. Single lifetime. And their grandchildren, born in the 1920s and 1930s, heard their stories firsthand. Those grandchildren are the last generation that carries the oral history of the old world, and they're almost gone. Mary Kelly was born in 1851 in Southfield, Michigan. She lived to 113 and died in 1964. She was alive before the Civil War and survived long enough to see television in every American home. Maggie Barnes was born to a formerly enslaved woman in the early 1880s and lived to approximately 1115, dying in 1998 in North Carolina. These weren't extraordinary cases. The Gerontology Research Group has verified 16 supercentenarians born in the 1850s alone. Dozens more lived past 100. Hundreds lived past 90. An entire generation of witnesses whose memories spanned two completely different worlds. The government had the chance to record all of them. It recorded 2,900. Then it stopped. The project was defunded in 1939 after congressional hearings, turned over to state control, and effectively shut down. The interviews were boxed up, not published in any accessible form until the 1970s. 30 years of silence around the last first-hand testimony of Americans who remembered what came before. Before what, exactly? That's where October 8, 1871 becomes impossible to ignore. Every American learns about the Great Chicago Fire. Mrs. O'Leary's cow, the wooden city, the rebuilding. What almost no one learns is what happened the same night at the same hour across 3 states simultaneously. In Peshtigo, Wisconsin, a firestorm consumed the entire town in approximately 1 hour. Between 2,000 and 2,500 people perished, making it the deadliest wildfire in American recorded history. The fire burned 1.2 million acres. Survivors describe winds strong enough to lift adults off the ground, flames that moved faster than a person could run, and a heat so intense that people crossing open ground simply burst into flame without being touched by visible fire. Reverend Peter Pernin, the parish priest who survived by submerging himself in the Peshtigo River, published his eyewitness account in 1874. He described a phenomenon that doesn't match any normal wildfire behavior. The available oxygen was consumed so rapidly that people who showed no burns were found deceased, as if the air itself had been weaponized. The fire created its own weather system, a vortex of superheated wind that behaved less like a forest fire and more like something detonating from a central point outward. The same night, Holland, Michigan burned. Manistee, Michigan burned. Port Huron, Michigan was threatened. Across 225 million acres of the upper Midwest, fires erupted simultaneously. The National Weather Service confirms these fires broke out across 3 states at the same time on the same evening. The official explanation is drought, lumber debris, and a cold front with high winds. Reasonable, except for one detail that has nagged researchers since 1883, the simultaneity. In 1883, a hypothesis emerged that fragments of Biela's comet had struck the atmosphere and ignited the fires from above. This theory was revisited in a 1997 documentary and investigated again in 2004 by the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics. Witnesses in Chicago reported blue flames burning in basements, a color consistent with unusual chemical combustion, not wood fires. The theory has never been proven. It has also never been disproven. But here's what matters for this investigation. The elderly Americans interviewed by the WPA writers in the 1930s were children in 1871. A 70-year-old interviewed in 1938 would have been 3 years old that night. An 80-year-old would have been 13, old enough to have watched the sky turn red, old enough to have been told by their parents exactly what happened. The Library of Congress describes those 2,900 interviews as containing tales of surviving the 1871 Chicago fire and pioneer journeys. But that description only scratches the surface. What else did those Americans remember? What did they tell the government writers about the night everything burned? And why was the project shut down before the full picture could emerge? The burning wasn't the only erasure. In 1890, the United States conducted the most comprehensive census in its history. For the first time, each family received an entire form. The census recorded immigration status, naturalization details, English language proficiency, home ownership, and Civil War service. 62.9 million Americans documented in unprecedented detail. It was also the first census for which the government broke from a century of protocol and did not require copies to be filed in local offices. Every previous census from 1790 to 1880 had local backups stored in county courthouses and state archives. The 1890 census existed in one location, the basement of the Commerce Department building in Washington, D.C. On January 10, 1921, a fire broke out in that basement. Approximately 25% of the records were destroyed outright. Another 50% suffered serious water and smoke damage. The investigation never determined a definitive cause. Theories range from a discarded cigarette to faulty wiring to spontaneous combustion of sawdust in the building's workshop. What happened next is more disturbing than the fire itself. The surviving records, perhaps half still usable, were moved to a warehouse. For 12 years, nothing happened. No restoration effort, no attempt to copy or preserve what remained. Then in December 1932, the chief clerk of the Bureau of Census sent the Librarian of Congress a list of documents scheduled for destruction. The 1890 census was on that list. The librarian was asked to identify any records worth preserving for historical purposes. He identified none. Congress authorized destruction on February 21, 1933. The next day, February 22, President Hoover laid the cornerstone for the National Archives building, the fireproof facility specifically created to prevent exactly this kind of loss. They destroyed the records one day before beginning construction of the building that would have saved them. Of 62.9 million names, roughly 6,160 survive. The single most detailed record of every American alive during the transition period, the people who remembered the old world, eliminated. Not by accident. By sequence. Fire, neglect, bureaucratic process, authorized destruction. Each step plausible on its own. Together, they form something harder to dismiss. And then there were the children. Between 1854 and 1929, approximately 250,000 children were loaded onto trains in New York, Boston, and Philadelphia, and transported to rural communities across the Midwest and West. The orphan train movement, organized primarily by the Children's Aid Society, founded in 1853 by Charles Loring Brace and later by the New York Foundling, in what contemporary accounts describe as auction-like events. Farming families inspected them, evaluated their size and apparent health, and selected the ones they wanted. Many were taken to work fields. Less than half were actual orphans. The rest were children of immigrants, children of the poor, children whose parents couldn't afford to feed them or couldn't fight the institutions that took them. An estimated 30,000 children lived on the streets of New York City in the 1850s alone. But here's the detail that nobody discusses. Upon arrival in their new communities, older children were strongly encouraged, sometimes required, to break all contact with their past. Names were changed. Origins were not recorded or were recorded inaccurately. The organizations that ran the program kept spotty records at best. Many children could not tell their own grandchildren where they came from because they genuinely didn't know. 250,000 Americans whose identities were functionally severed. An entire generation disconnected from their own history by institutional design. The timing is precise. The orphan trains ran from 1854 to 1929. The fires occurred in 1871. The giant photographs clustered between 1850 and 1900. Tartaria vanished from maps in the mid-1800s. The architectural transition from grand classical to simplified modern happened in the same window. And the 1890 census, the one record that would have documented every single person alive during this transition, was eliminated. Not coincidence. Pattern. Which brings me to 1893 and the buildings they don't want you to think about too carefully. The World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago. 27 million visitors across 6 months. Over 200 buildings spread across 630 acres of Jackson Park. The White City. Official history tells us these massive neoclassical structures, enormous domes rivaling European cathedrals, columns and sculptural detail as precise as ancient Rome, cement and jute fiber over wooden frames. Built with horse-drawn equipment, hand tools and manual labor, no cranes, no bulldozers, no modern construction technology, 200 buildings in 630 acres in under 24 months. And then, after 6 months of display, nearly every single structure was demolished. The only major building that survived is the Palace of Fine Arts, now the Museum of Science and Industry, preserved because it had been fireproof to protect the art collections inside. Everything else was torn down or burned. This pattern repeated. Paris, 1889, Buffalo, 1901, St. Louis, 1904, San Francisco, 1915. Build magnificent structures of impossible scale and detail, display them briefly, destroy them completely, every time. The elderly Americans interviewed in the 1930s remembered the White City. Some had visited as children or young adults. They walked through those buildings and saw something that looked nothing like the America being constructed around them. Something older, something grander, something that felt less like a temporary exhibition and more like a city that had always been there. And then it was gone. Here's what I keep coming back to. There was a woman, there had to have been, in every county in America in the early 1950s. A woman born in the late 1850s, living past 90, sitting in a house surrounded by grandchildren who'd grown up hearing her stories. Stories about buildings that were already ancient when she was young, but that the textbooks claimed were built just years before. Stories about the night the sky turned red across 3 states. Stories about trains full of children heading west with no names, no families, no pasts. Stories about a world that operated differently than anything her grandchildren saw around them. A world of different proportions, different architecture, different knowledge. And when she tried to tell them, when she described what she remembered, they nodded politely and changed the subject. Because her memories didn't match the textbooks. And in 1950s America, the textbooks always won. The WPA caught some of these voices, 2,900 documents from 24 states. But what about the other 24 states? What about the thousands of elderly Americans who were never interviewed? What about the stories that were told across kitchen tables and front porches and deathbeds in the 1940s and 1950s that no government writer recorded? Those stories passed to grandchildren who are now in their 80s and 90s. The last human chain connecting us to first-hand memory of whatever existed before the transition. The timeline isn't subtle. The old world architecture stands everywhere. Oversized doorways, impossible construction, buildings scaled for someone other than us. The 1871 fires simultaneously destroy cities across 3 states in a single night. The 1890 census captures 62.9 million names during the transition. Then the only copy is stored without backup for the first time in American history. The 1890s, the photographs of giants stop appearing. The skeleton discoveries stop being reported. The maps are quietly redrawn. The 1893 White City is built, displayed, and demolished. The orphan trains finish relocating 250,000 children with severed identities. The 1921 fire damages the census. The 1933 order destroys what's left. The 1936 WPA project scrambles to interview the last witnesses. It's defunded 3 years later. By the 1950s, the last Americans who saw the old world with their own eyes are gone, and their grandchildren choose silence because the alternative is too enormous to process. The Library of Congress still has those 2,900 documents, transcribed testimonies from Americans who lived through whatever this was. They've been publicly available since the 1970s. They're searchable, they're readable, and I have to wonder, has anyone gone through every single one? Has anyone searched them for the details that don't fit? For the memories that contradict the official record, for the specific descriptions of buildings, fires, proportions, and because the last Americans who remembered are gone. Their grandchildren are almost gone. But the words are still in the archive, and archives don't forget, not even when everyone else agrees. The documents preserve what the encyclopedias erased. And somewhere in those 2,900 transcriptions, in the careful handwriting of Depression-era government workers recording the memories of Americans born before the transition, the truth is sitting in a filing cabinet, waiting, the same way it's been waiting for almost a century. For someone willing to read what the last witnesses actually said, instead of what we've been told they should have remembered. footage you just saw is real. A woman in a corset standing in a painted garden. She reaches behind an oversized cabbage. She pulls out a living baby. She sets it on the ground like produce. Then she does it again. That film is from 1900. It is the oldest surviving narrative film in existence. The woman playing the fairy is Yvonne Mugnier-Serand. The director is Alice Guy Blache. And nobody talks about why this particular story was the first one cinema ever told. February 1896. Paris. A 22-year-old secretary named Alice Guy walks down Boulevard Poissonnière. She is heading toward the cabarets of Montmartre. But she stops at a storefront she has never noticed before. The windows are lit. Inside, against the wall, are rows of glass and metal boxes. Inside those boxes are living human babies, premature infants, some small enough to fit in a man's palm. They are lying in machines modeled after chicken egg incubators, because that is exactly what they are. The inventor, a French engineer named Alexandre Lion, patented this device on October 28, 1889. He based it on poultry equipment, and he funded the entire operation by charging the public admission to come watch newborns to see these babies in the first year alone. Alice Guy was one of them. Her granddaughter, Regine Blache-Bolton, confirmed this decades later. Alice walked into that storefront, saw infants displayed in glass boxes for paying strangers, and 3 months later created the first narrative film ever recorded. A fairy harvesting babies from a cabbage garden. The Art Nouveau poster advertising Lyon's exhibition makes the connection even more explicit. Designed by Adolfo Hohenstein, it shows a nurse cradling 3 infants. Behind her, vines sprout baby heads in place of flowers. Drawings of children growing like botanical specimens fill the background. This poster depicted as things that grow on plants, not born, grown. That visual language appeared on a Paris boulevard before the postcards, before the dolls, before any of it. Now here is where most people who have covered this topic start. The postcards. Between the postcards flooded Europe and North America, showing babies growing in cabbage patches, babies being pulled from the earth like vegetables, babies tended by gardeners and delivered to couples who browse through them like shoppers selecting fruit. These were not produced by a single company running a campaign. They came from dozens of studios across Germany, France, Russia, Spain, Britain, and the United States. Multiple languages, multiple artistic styles, no documented coordinating source. Art historians classify them as whimsical birth announcements, sentimental imagery, harmless folklore. And they are partially right. In France, children had been told for centuries that boys come from cabbage patches and girls from rose bushes. French parents still call their babies mon petit chou, my little cabbage. In Scotland, children placed cabbage leaves outside to ask fairies for siblings. In Ireland, you were told you were found under a stalk of cabbage. The folklore is old and widespread, so let me address this directly. Maybe the postcards are exactly what art historians say they are. Birth announcements based on folk tradition. Charming, innocent, unconnected to anything darker. If this were the whole picture, I would accept that explanation and move on. But the timeline refuses to stay innocent. Because during the exact decades these postcards circulated, between 1900 and 1920, the largest mass displacement of children in American history was underway, and the scale of it is difficult to process. September 20, 1854. A train pulls out of New York City carrying 46 children. They range from infants to 12 years old. No parents are with them. No family waits at the destination. When they arrive in Dowagiac, Michigan, they are lined up on a railroad platform. Local families walk past, inspect them, and choose which ones to take home. This is the first orphan train. The last train departs on May 31st, 1929, carrying 3 children to Sulphur Springs, Texas. By then, between 200,000 and 250,000 children will have been transported this way. At peak volume, 3,000 to 4,000 children per year. Smith let passengers adopt boys without checking references. He played on audience sympathy, pointing out that boys were handy and girls could be used for all types of housework. Many of these children were used strictly as farm labor. Many were not orphans at all. They were children of immigrants and poor families. The co-founders of the program in uncomfortable conditions, sometimes on trains barely better than cattle cars. 2 or 3 adult chaperones supervised 30 to 40 children at a time. When they arrived, they had no birth certificates, no verified family histories, no provable identity. An estimated 2 million descendants are alive today, many of whom still cannot trace their lineage past the train platform. Where did they come from? The Cabbage Patch. That was the answer the culture gave. Not literally, but functionally. The mythology did the same work as a shrug. And the orphan trains were only the American chapter. Across the Atlantic, the system was older and larger. The foundling wheel, called the ruota in Italy, was a rotating wooden cylinder built into the wall of a hospital or church. A woman could place her infant inside, ring a bell, and the staff on the other side would rotate the wheel to receive the child. Anonymous. No questions, no records of the parent. The first one was installed in Rome in 1198. By the 1400s, they had spread across Catholic Europe. By the 1800s, the numbers are staggering. Over 100,000 foundlings abandoned annually across the continent. In France, Italy, and Spain, as many as 1 in 3 babies born in cities was deposited into these institutions. France alone had 251 foundling wheels at their peak, legalized on January 19, 1811. The death rate inside these foundling hospitals averaged 80%. In some years, it approached 100%. Children who survived were renamed. In Italy, they were called Esposito, meaning exposed. In Milan, they were named Colombo, after the pigeons outside the foundling home. In France, they were called Trouvé, found. Parents sometimes left a token, a ribbon, a coin, a piece of torn fabric, hoping to reclaim the child someday. Most never returned. So now hold the timeline in your mind. 198, the first foundling wheel is installed in Rome. By the 1700s, boys from cabbages, girls from roses is the standard. 1811, France legalizes 251 foundling wheels. 1854, the first orphan train leaves New York. 1863, France begins closing its foundling wheels. 1869, Sister Mary Irene Fitzgibbon places a cradle on a Manhattan stoop to receive abandoned babies, founding the New York Foundling Hospital. 1889, Alexander Lyon patents his baby incubator, modeled on chicken egg equipment. February 1896, Alice Guy visits Lyon's incubator exhibition on Boulevard Poissonnière and sees babies in glass boxes displayed for paying strangers. Spring 1896, she films La Fée aux Choux. The first narrative film in history is about harvesting babies from a garden. That same year, incubator babies are exhibited at the Berlin Exposition under the name Kinderbrutenstalt. That word translates to child hatchery. 1900 to 1920, cabbage baby postcards flood the Western world. 1903, Martin Cooney opens his permanent incubator exhibit at Coney Island, displaying premature infants next to sword swallowers and sideshow acts. He charges 25 cents admission. He runs it for 40 years. Each piece connects to the next, each decade adds another layer, and every layer uses the same language. Children as things that are grown, harvested, displayed, selected, and distributed. Not born to families, delivered to them by fairies, by gardeners, by institutions. I need to be honest about something. I sat with this research for almost a week before I started writing. Not because the facts were hard to find. They are well documented. The orphan trains have a PBS documentary. The foundling wheels are in medical journals. Alice Guy Blash's visit to the incubator exhibition is confirmed by her own granddaughter. The problem was not evidence. The problem was that every time I laid the timeline out, I could hear how it would sound. I could hear reasonable people saying I was forcing a pattern onto unrelated events. And I kept asking myself whether that was true. Whether folklore is just folklore. Whether postcards are just postcards. Whether the fact that all of this clusters in the same decades across the same countries is simply what coincidence looks like at scale. But then I found what Salvador Dali said about the postcards. Dali collected them. So did André Breton. So did Paul Eluard, who called them a Lilliputian hallucination of the world. Dali called them the most lively document of popular modern thought, a thought so profound or so sharp that it eludes psychoanalysis. The surrealists did not collect them as whimsy. They collected them because they recognized something in the imagery that resisted easy explanation. A British art dealer named James Birch began collecting them in Aix-en-Provence. He later found a display case of them at the Pompidou Center, exhibited for their inspirational importance to the Dadaists and Surrealists. He published a book called Babylon, Surreal Babies in 2010. Even the art world knew these postcards carried something heavier than charm. And the postcards were not gentle. Some of them show babies being sold. Some reference lotteries of children. Some depict gardeners tending rows of infants while couples browse and point. The imagery is commercial, transactional. It mirrors the mechanics of the foundling system and the orphan trains with disturbing precision. Babies appear from the earth. They have no parents, no origin story, no history. Someone selects them, someone takes them home. This is not what a birth announcement looks like. This is what displacement looks like when a culture has agreed to call it something else. The medical establishment during this era makes the picture darker. Martin Cooney, the man who ran baby incubator exhibits at Coney Island for 4 decades, likely never held a legitimate medical license. He fabricated his credentials because the real medical profession refused to help premature babies at all. A Chicago doctor produced a film advocating for letting them die, tagged "Kill Defectives, Save the Nation." The Boston Medical and Surgical Journal questioned in 1901 whether saving premature infants was even worthwhile. The eugenics movement called them weaklings who would pollute the gene pool. Display in a glass box at an amusement park. Cooney saved over 6,500 lives this way. His nurse, Madame Recht, would slide a diamond ring up a baby's arm to the shoulder to show audiences how small the infants were. When Cooney died, his death certificate did not mention medicine. Neither did Alexandre Lyon's. Lion, the man whose invention inspired the first movie ever made, was described on his death certificate in 1934 as a wandering salesman. 80 years after the postcards faded from circulation, the story came back. In 1976, a 21-year-old Georgia art student named Xavier Roberts discovered dolls at a craft fair made by a Kentucky folk artist named Martha Nelson Thomas. Thomas had been making what she called doll babies since the early 1970s. Each one came with a birth certificate and adoption papers. Roberts purchased her dolls, then began making his own when Thomas cut him off. He renamed them Little People. A licensing agent named Roger Schleifer renamed them Cabbage Patch Kids in 1982 and created the origin mythology. The official story said Xavier Roberts was a 10-year-old boy who followed a bunny bee behind a waterfall into a magical cabbage patch where babies were being born. Roberts sold the dolls from Babyland General Hospital, a converted abandoned medical clinic in Georgia. He did not sell them, you adopted them. Each doll came with a unique birth certificate and adoption papers, no parents listed. Born in a cabbage patch. Martha Nelson Thomas, the woman who actually created the concept, sued Roberts. They settled out of court in 1985 for an undisclosed amount. Her name disappeared from the product. Sound familiar? Coleco Mass produced them in 1983. 3 million sold by the end of that year. 20 million in 1984. $2 billion in retail sales. Americans physically fought each other in stores to adopt these dolls. Dolls with no parents, born from cabbages, distributed through a converted hospital. The entire apparatus of the foundling system compressed into a toy. And nobody noticed what the story was actually about because the story had been telling itself for 800 years. Every culture needs a narrative to explain what it cannot say plainly. You do not tell a child their sibling was deposited in a wooden box in a church wall by a mother who could not afford to feed them. You tell the child their sibling was found in the cabbage patch. You do not tell a community that 250,000 children were stripped of their identities and shipped across a continent. You send postcards of babies growing in gardens, tended by fairies delivered to loving homes. The fairy tale does the work of erasure. It always has. Alice Guy Blash saw babies in glass boxes on a Paris boulevard and turned the experience into the first story cinema ever told. That story was about a fairy pulling children from a garden. The original 1896 film is now lost. 90% of all films made before 1929 are gone. We preserved almost nothing from the birth of cinema. The one film that might tell us what the culture was processing when it chose this story, as its first, has vanished. The postcards are in museum archives. The orphan train records are in genealogical databases. The foundling wheel mechanisms still sit in the walls of old hospitals across Europe. The Cabbage Patch Kids are in attics and storage units across America, each one with its adoption certificate still tucked inside. And somewhere between folklore and documentation, between fairy tale and institutional record, there is a question no one has properly asked. What story does a civilization came from? What mythology does it build when the truth is too large, too systemic, too uncomfortable for a direct answer? And when that mythology appears in the first film, the most popular postcards, and the best-selling toy of the 20th century, all using the same image: babies without parents, harvested from a garden. What exactly are we looking at? A coincidence that spans 8 centuries and 6 continents, or the longest-running cover story in Western history? In September of 1898, a 9-year-old boy walks into a Barnardo's orphanage. The building sits in Stepney, in the East End of London. His father died on Christmas. Intake form notes his good health and records his height. He stands 4 feet tall, which is perfectly normal for his age. Within months, Barnardo ships him across the Atlantic to work on a Canadian farm. He's 9 years old, completely alone, and now property of the system. He returns to England at 15, and something has changed inside him. A congenital knee problem has triggered uncontrolled bone growth in his legs. By 22, he towers at 7 feet 4 inches. By 1913, he exceeds 7 feet 9 inches and is still growing. And here is where this story turns from sad to something else entirely. A director at Barnardo's personally volunteers him for a public exhibition. The event is a parade of giants at the Crystal Palace in London. The event celebrates the coronation of King George V. The boy is billed as the biggest boy in Britain. His name is Frederick Kempster. Within weeks of that exhibition, circus promoters come calling. Frederick signs with Astley and Company's American Circus. He tours Europe under stage names like Teddy Bobbs and Frederick the Great. His real height is 7 feet 9 inches, but management bills him at 8 feet 4, sometimes 8 feet 8. The exaggeration sells more tickets. Frederick Kempster, orphan, farm labourer, charity case, is now a professional giant. He will spend the rest of his short life being stared at for money. He contracts influenza while touring in Blackburn in 1918. The illness develops into pneumonia. He never recovers. He is 29 years old when he is buried in a 9-foot coffin in Blackburn Cemetery. His gravestone reads, "The British Giant," not his name, his product label. I need you to understand what happened here. A child entered a charitable institution at a normal height. That institution shipped him overseas as unpaid labor. When his body began growing beyond medical explanation, that same institution delivered him to the entertainment industry. A Barnardo's director, J.P. Manuel, made the introduction. This was not a rogue employee. This was an institutional decision. The orphanage that was supposed to protect Frederick Kempster instead turned his body into a commodity. And Frederick's case is only remarkable because it is documented. His great decades later, his siblings kept his memory alive. His intake records survived. His circus contracts are traceable. For every Frederick Kempster whose story we can reconstruct, how many others passed through the same systems without anyone recording what happened to them? The numbers demand the question. Between 1869 and 1948, Barnardo's alone shipped approximately 30,000 children from Britain to Canada. The broader Home Children program moved over 100,000. On the American side, the orphan train system relocated an estimated 250,000 children between 1854 and 1929. Combined, these systems processed more than 350,000 children in the same decades. The sideshow industry reached its peak. Pituitary gigantism occurs in roughly 8 cases per million people. It typically begins in early childhood when a tumor on the pituitary gland causes excess growth hormone production. Children appear normal at birth. The growth acceleration starts between ages 3 and 7. By age 9, some stand 6 feet tall. By 14, they tower over every adult in the room. Do the arithmetic. 350,000 children processed across both systems, 8 cases of gigantism per million people. The math says at least 2 or 3 children would have developed visible gigantism during their institutional years. That is a conservative estimate. In reality, the number was likely higher. These systems drew from populations experiencing poverty, malnutrition, and disease, conditions that can mask or delay diagnosis. Children with unusual growth would have been noticed by matrons and doctors during intake examinations. The other children in the dormitory would have watched them outgrow every bed. What happened to those children? Consider what we know about the ones with names. Edouard Beaupré was born in 1881 in Willowbunch, Saskatchewan. Normal at birth. By age 9, he stood 6 feet tall. By 17, 7 feet 1 inch. His family needed money. A neighbor suggested he could earn a living touring as a strongman. Edouard left home at 17, chaperoned by family friends, and spent his remaining years on the sideshow circuit. He was shy, he hated crowds, he hated cities, he drank to cope. Tuberculosis consumed him. He collapsed at the St. Louis World's Fair in 1904 and never recovered. He was 23, but that is not the worst of it. After Edouard died, his father traveled to St. Louis to bring the body home. He could not afford the transportation costs. Think about that for a moment. The circus profited from Edouard for years. When he collapsed, the business simply moved on. And his father, the man who raised him, could not scrape together enough money to bury his own son. The undertakers embalmed the body and put it on display in a storefront window. Police shut that down. A businessman shipped the body to Montreal, where it was exhibited at the entrance of a museum for over 6 months. Then the circus that had it went bankrupt and dumped the body in a warehouse. In 1907, children playing in the warehouse found his preserved remains. The University of Montreal claimed the body, mummified it, and placed it in a glass case. The family did not discover what had happened until 1967. They fought for decades to recover the remains. The university refused. It took until 1989 for the family to finally return and buried in 1990, 86 years. His naked, mummified body was on display for medical students and curiosity seekers. His family's words still echo. How could they do that to someone and erase them? It is like they never existed. That phrase keeps repeating across these histories. Erased. Like they never existed. It describes the home children too. An estimated 65% of British home children in Canada. Children forbidden from eating with the families that were supposed to care for them. One girl was whipped, beaten, and moved 20 times in less than 8 years. She was 14 when she gave birth to a stillborn baby. 75 children were found buried in unmarked graves in a single Toronto cemetery. A researcher using archival records and death certificates identified every one of them. They represent everything that was wrong with child immigration, she said. And Bernardo's, the organization that processed Frederick Kempster, had a specific documented pattern that makes all of this worse. Thomas Bernardo was taken to court multiple times by parents trying to recover their own children. In one case, he sent 2 children abroad and hid a third. The court issued writs of habeas corpus demanding their return. Bernardo claimed he had no knowledge of their whereabouts. A researcher studying his organization described it plainly. He built himself an industry, and that industry had to be fed children. Parents placed their children in Bernardo's homes as a temporary measure during hard times. They returned to find their children had been shipped to another continent without consent. The system was not designed to reunite families. It was designed to move bodies from one place to another with as little accountability as possible. Let me address the skeptic's position directly. Frederick Kempster's case may be unique. One documented instance of an orphanage delivering a giant child to a circus does not prove a systematic pipeline. The incomplete records might reflect genuine administrative chaos rather than deliberate concealment. Most children in these systems were placed with families, not exhibited. Some found good homes. The sideshow industry was, for some performers, a genuine source of income and community in an era that offered few alternatives. For nearly 2 weeks, I reviewed every counter-argument. I wanted the mainstream explanation to work because the alternative is ugly. But what broke me was not any single piece of evidence. It was the realization that the official narrative rests entirely on the absence of evidence. We do not know how many children with unusual growth pass through these institutions because the records are incomplete. We do not know what happened to children who disappeared between intake and placement because the files are sealed. We do not know whether other Frederick Kempsters existed because Barnardo's, the Children's Aid Society, and the New York Foundling Hospital will not open their archives for independent review. The absence of proof is doing all the work. And institutions asking us to trust them are the same ones that ship children overseas without consent. The same ones that lost track of thousands and buried 75 of them in unmarked graves. Ella Ewing was born in 1872 in Missouri. Normal-sized as a baby. Abnormal growth beginning at age 7. 6 feet 10 inches by 14. Over 8 feet 4 by adulthood. A museum agent named Louis Epstein traveled from Chicago to rural Missouri specifically to recruit her after hearing rumors. He offered $1,000 for 27 days of exhibition. Her father initially refused. He thought it clashed with their Baptist values, but the money exceeded what he could earn in 5 years of farming. Ella spent 17 years on the circuit. She had parents who negotiated her contracts. She had a community who knew her. She had a name the whole time. The sideshow photographers tell us something different about the giants who had none of those protections. Charles Eisenman operated a studio on the Bowery in New York from the 1870s through the 1890s. The Bowery was the entertainment district, home to dime museums and cheap amusements. It was also just blocks from the orphanages processing thousands of children each year. Eisenman photographed hundreds of performers. His subjects include giants, but many of them carry only stage names. Their biographies were written by promoters who invented whatever story would sell tickets. Their real origins were fabricated or left blank entirely. Robert Bogdan, the Syracuse University professor who wrote the definitive academic study of the American sideshow, put it simply: for a lot of the people in these acts, there are no written birth records, no family, no origin beyond whatever story sold tickets. Where did they come from? Who were they before the stage name? That question matters more when you understand what the sideshow industry did with giant bodies even after death. Edouard Beaupré was not an isolated case. The exploitation did not end when the performer stopped breathing. It accelerated to be buried at sea after his death in 1783. The surgeon John Hunter purchased his corpse against Burns' explicit wishes. The skeleton was displayed at the Royal College of Surgeons in London for over 200 years. It was only removed in 2023 after a sustained public campaign. Giants were not just exhibited alive, they were collected dead. Their bodies were treated as specimens, as property, as curiosities worth more than the living person who inhabited them. If the system treated giant adults this way, adults with names and families and public profiles, what did it do with giant children who had no one? You might be closer to this story than you realize. An estimated 2 million Americans descend from orphan train riders. As many as 4 million Canadians carry home children ancestry. If your family tree hits a wall somewhere between 1870 and 1900, these systems may be the reason. If there is a name that changes inexplicably or a generation that simply goes blank, you are not alone. The institutions that processed these children sealed their records. The New York Foundling Hospital provides only non-identifying information to descendants. Barnardo's archives remain restricted. The Children's Aid Society requires proof of relation before releasing any files. The people who severed these children's identities are the same people controlling access to the evidence, and they have maintained that control for over a century. The records are not missing. They are locked. Frederick Kempster entered a Barnardo's orphanage at 4 feet tall. He left the sideshow circuit in a 9-foot coffin. Between those two measurements lies a story the institution that processed him has never been required to explain. Not because the explanation would be innocent, because nobody with the authority to demand one ever has. Barnardo's has never publicly addressed how one of its directors came to volunteer an orphanage child for exhibition. The records of other children who passed through the same system during the same decades remain sealed. The names are still in those files. The intake measurements are still there. The transfer records, or the absence of transfer records, are still there. 350,000 children move through these systems. We celebrate the ones who became governors and farmers and family patriarchs. We mourn the ones found in unmarked graves. But between those outcomes, in the gap between the celebrated and the buried, there is a third category nobody talks about. The ones who became exhibits. The ones whose bodies were worth more on display than on a farm. The ones whose unusual growth made them valuable to an industry that peaked in the exact decade these institutions processed their highest volumes of children. Frederick Kempster is the only one we can name with certainty. Edouard Beaupré had family who fought for 86 years to bring him home. The giants in Eisenman's photographs had no one at all. Their images survive in university archives and auction catalogues. Their names do not. And until someone opens those sealed records and maps every intake against every outcome, the gap remains. Until someone accounts for every child whose body outgrew the institution that was supposed to protect them, we are left trusting the same organizations that ship children across oceans, the same ones that refuse to return them to their parents, the same ones that buried 75 of them in an unmarked Toronto grave. We are trusting them to tell us nothing else went wrong. The photographs persist. The sealed files persist. The gap between what we know and what we're allowed to know persists wider than any doorway in any government building. And somewhere in that gap, children who grew too tall for their orphanage beds disappeared from their bodies.